You hear me now?
Yes.
A little feedback there. Are you the 415 number? Hi, Councilmember Dawson. I do see you're in the waiting.
Christine Rasmussen will be a few minutes late. She wanted me to report for her.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Dawson, I did see Marion Dury join. We don't typically, the alternates usually attend as they wish, but I'll look once the chair has sound to how we want to proceed there.
Rhonda, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. You're a little bit glitchy, and there's a lot of feedback.
Hold on, I've got.
If you have headphones, that usually helps. There's a
How about
big
now?
echo.
Breaking up.
Ugh. Let me dial back in, Renata. Give me a minute.
Okay.
While Matt's dialing back in, did I overhear as I came on that now the Rotary family represented on the GPAC exceeds the Singer family and the Library family, which have two each?
But by my count, there I think at least 4 Rotarians on the GPAC at this point. So,
Carl, I enjoyed your letter in the new what the successor to Lafayette Social.
Yes,
Was it the go slow part that warmed your heart?
Among other things, yes.
Okay, how about that?
good.
Sounds good.
Okay. Let's see, it looks like we're live on YouTube. Are we ready to go, Renata?
Yes, we are, Chair.
Okay. Well, look, I want to call the meeting of the GPAC for January 19th to order. I want to thank you for attending. We are being recorded, and the recording will be made live on our YouTube channel by tomorrow. What I'd like to do is start with a roll call to make sure that we've got a quorum. Renata, could I ask you to do a roll call, please?
Absolutely. Carol Singer.
Here.
Thank you. Emma Hunt.
Now here.
Thank you. And just before we started, City Clerk Joanne Robbins-Warren, our Senior Services Commission representative, Conrad Reese. So Conrad.
Here.
Present. Thank you.
Present.
Stella Wotherspoon.
Present.
Chair Pease.
Present.
Thank you. Beth Needle,
Present.
Jim Cervantes,
Present.
Sarah Blumenthal,
Here.
Susie Kelly,
Here.
Christine Rasmussen will join us shortly, and Chris Lee is absent. We have a new Planning Commission liaison, Greg Mason.
Oh,
Present.
Thank you so much for joining us. And Mayor Andrew.
Present.
Thank you. That is everybody.
Great. Well, we have a new group member, Conrad Bruce, is joining us to represent the senior community. Conrad, can I ask you to give a real brief introduction about your background?
Certainly. My wife, Joan, and I have lived in Lafayette since 1984. Our adult daughter went through Happy Valley School, Stanley School, and graduated from Camp Lindo and from Boston University, and has a master's from an entity that now is Boston University, was previously another entity. And I practiced law in San Francisco, primarily in the real estate field, for 46 years.
Very good. Okay. Could I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
I move we adopt the agenda for January 19th, 2023.
Thank you, Carol. And could I have a second on that?
I'll second that.
Okay, Susie, we have the second. I think Jim was trying to raise his hand to second it also. With consent, then we will adopt the agenda. What I'd
actually,
also like to do,
Chairpiece.
Jim, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just got a text from Chris Lee, who is having trouble with the Zoom link. I don't know if Renata, if you could forward that to her again, that would be, then she can join us. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. What I'd like to also do while Renata is multitasking here is to also invite any public comment for items that are not on the agenda that they would like to comment on. So Renata, could I ask you to inform anybody that's online from the public that they can log in and let us know if they've got any issues that they'd like to have addressed.
Sure. If you would like to make a public comment for items not on tonight's agenda, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. And there are no hands raised here.
Okay. Well, then we will proceed. Renata, before we get into the staff presentation, can I ask if possible, if you could put up the schedule that we originally put together for the safety element?
Yes, so actually that is included in the presentation, the slides for this evening.
Well, look, go ahead and bring that up then.
Yeah, so I'm bringing in Eli Crispy, the project manager on the Placework side. And I'll ask him to share his screen since he'll be doing a bunch of the presenting tonight.
Okay.
Sorry for the short notice, Eli.
While that's coming up, the reason I wanted to bring that up was to make sure everybody knows where we are in the cycle of going through the safety element. And also just to check in with both the staff and the consulting team to make sure that they're comfortable that we can stay on that schedule, or if there's any adjustments that we're going to have to make going forward. So as soon as that comes up, we'll take a look at it, and I'll just wait to hear from both you, Renata, and Eli to see if there's any issues with the schedule at this point.
Eli, do you want me to pull that up?
I'm happy to, or you can,
Okay.
if you would like. If I do it, I would need screen sharing enabled.
Yes, okay. I just changed the settings. Sorry about that.
Thank you, no problem. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it is.
All right,
Thank you very much.
this is the schedule I think that we had discussed.
Yes, thank you. So this is the schedule that was presented to GPAC back in, I want to say October or November, and then brought back again in December. So we had our November and December meetings at the end of last year, and we are now at our special meeting on January 19th. Moving forward, we will have our first community workshop on Tuesday, the 24th, to review the climate change vulnerability assessment, which we'll be discussing today for the first time. We'll be discussing the vulnerability assessment for the first time tonight, and then opening up to the broader public again at the community workshop on Tuesday. GPAC will then have another opportunity at the February meeting once staff has received comments from GPAC tonight, as well as members of the public during the workshop, to review a revised version of their vulnerability assessment. So I did receive some feedback from GPAC members that there was short notice on the staff report for tonight's meeting. I do apologize. We're doing our best to provide the best work product possible on a quick turnaround from the holidays. But I want to assure GPAC members that there is about a month for feedback, and as with the housing element process, the entirety of the safety element is draft until it is adopted by City Council. So even as we're going through and reviewing the draft safety element in March and April, comments on this vulnerability assessment are welcome, although we do want to try and focus them to this time between now and February, because the vulnerability assessment will then inform those draft goals, policies, and programs. So I want to assure you, we do have time for comments and additional review, but that is our, we do want to make sure we have an endpoint with which the consultant team has feedback to move forward. So looking forward to February, we'll be reviewing draft goals, policies, and programs. And then in March, reviewing the full packet along with a community workshop again for the public to provide their input. So I feel as though we are on track with the schedule. I'll let Eli chime in if there's anything different. But I think also the next slide does also include a little bit more detail about kind of the process, the other work that's happening as well. So we are reviewing the vulnerability assessment right now, and as part of that review of the draft safety element, we'll also be reviewing the background report. So that's kind of just the lay of the land, data, maps, kind of context to set the scene and inform and ahead of the rest of the safety element, which includes the vulnerability assessment, the goals, policies, and programs. Is there anything you'd like to add? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask Eli, from your perspective with your team, are you okay with this schedule and feel like you've got the right resources to help us address all of these?
Yes, we don't have any particular concerns about this schedule. It is accelerated, so there is, I think, a faster review time that would accompany that. But as long as we can stay on track and get documents reviewed in a timely manner, I don't think this poses any challenges.
Good. Okay. Well, with that, Renata, I will turn it back to both you and Eli to go through the safety element presentation. And then after that, what we'll do is see if there are questions on the part of GPAC members. And then after that, we will go through public comment. And then after the public comment, we will return to GPAC and get feedback and additional discussion about that before we move to housekeeping. Carol, you had a question before we got started there.
Yes, I have the December timeline, but this one, is it available somewhere, the new one?
We can provide the slides after the meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Gladly.
Thank
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. So just to zoom out a little bit for the presentation tonight, as I mentioned, Eli will be kind of walking us through the vulnerability assessment and the methodology, to get us to this draft document. So here's the kind of flow of events. We were touching on the timeline and our progress through the safety element update. Eli will go through some of the key terms, which we briefly touched on in the staff report, and he'll provide some more background on that, and as well as the methodology. And then we'll walk through some of the key findings from the assessment and seek the input from the GPAC as well as members of the public. So with that, I think we can advance forward to the key terms, and I'll let Eli take it from here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Renata, and thank you, members of the GPAC. So to the vulnerability assessment, this is a requirement under state law, and it is an analysis that identifies how people and key community assets in Lafayette may be affected by climate change. And when we refer to assets, we mean any non-human aspect of the community, any feature of the community. This includes buildings, infrastructure, natural resources, as well as intangible things such as key community services or important economic sectors. The vulnerability assessment really lets us understand who and what in Lafayette is most at risk of climate change and of hazards that are associated with climate change. And then that acts as a foundation to let us develop policies that will be included in the safety element as a way of addressing these vulnerabilities. So these are some of the key terms that we use in the vulnerability assessment, and they're also going to be carried through into the overall safety element. So when we speak of hazards in this context, what we mean is any sort of event that may be harmful to the community in some way. That can include disasters or emergencies, floods, wildfires, landslides, and the like. But it can also include other harmful situations, drought, extreme heat, poor air quality, things that are not typically thought of as a disaster, but which can still have significant negative consequences to Lafayette. Those effects of hazards on people and on community assets are what we call impacts. And the ability of a population or asset to resist impacts or to recover from them using whatever tools, resources, and funding may be currently available, we refer to that capacity as adaptive capacity. So you'll see the term hazard, impact, and adaptive capacity come up over and over again in the methods. And then when we speak about vulnerability, what we mean is the degree to which a population or asset may be harmed by the hazard. So the greater the impact and the lower the adaptive capacity, the greater the vulnerability. And I will go into that in a little more detail in a bit. I do want to be clear that when we speak of vulnerability in this case, it is not meant to be any kind of judgment call. There's no moral censure attached to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that people who are considered vulnerable are responsible for that vulnerability. It doesn't mean that they could necessarily have made different choices that would reduce their vulnerability. And it also doesn't mean that they lack any kind of security or stability, or indeed that they are vulnerable in all other aspects of their life. It is meant to be a term that reflects their potential susceptibility to hazardous conditions and how those conditions are expected to change over time. You will also hear us refer to resilience. Resilience is the opposite of vulnerability. So when we speak of a population or asset that is resilient, what we mean is a population or asset that can effectively prepare for, recover from, and adapt to hazards and other harmful events. And resilience is really an aspirational goal. There isn't going to be a point where we can say that Lafayette or any individual population or asset has achieved 100% resiliency and that we can stop right there and no more work needs to be done. It is always meant to be something that the community is improving and working towards and getting better at. So hopefully that makes sense. I would be happy to answer any questions on the terminology, but if that foundation works for everyone, I can get into a discussion of how we drafted the vulnerability assessment itself. So we followed a 4-step process, and this is a process that is recommended by the state. We begin by looking at the climate change related hazards that are present in Lafayette and how they are expected to change in the future. We determine who and what in Lafayette may be exposed to them. That's the first stage, identify exposure. We then consider the populations and assets that are present in the community and how severe the impacts of the hazards are likely to be. That's a second step. We look at the adaptive capacity of the populations and assets in Lafayette, given current programs, funding resources, available tools, and so on. That's the third step. And then lastly, we sort of bring all these pieces together, and that lets us produce an overall vulnerability score. I know the GPAC members have reviewed the list of populations, assets, and hazards in the past. As you may remember from past meetings, there are 7 hazards that we are assessing, shown here. We use maps and other geospatial data to inform the assessment of who and what is at risk. We take these maps and we overlay them with locations of people, potentially vulnerable populations, and community assets to sort of understand who and what is located in the at-risk areas. We do understand that hazards can affect people and assets that are outside of mapped hazard zones. Hazards do not respect lines on a map, and certainly some hazards can go in places where we don't always expect them to. So we don't use the maps as the only way of making the determination of who and what is at risk, but it is part of that process. Now, once we've determined that a population or asset may be affected by a hazard, we score that population or asset's impact and adaptive capacity for that individual hazard. So for every hazard that a population or asset may be vulnerable to, that population or asset will get a distinct score for each hazard. We score impact on a scale from low to high. This is the scoring rubric that we use. It's worth remembering that an impact score of low does not mean that there are no impacts. It just means that those impacts are minor and are not expected to be substantially disruptive. Adaptive capacity is scored using a similar rubric from low to high. In this case, a low adaptive capacity score is worse. Low adaptive capacity means there is relatively little ability to resist or recover from the effects of the hazard. Sometimes we understand that the impact between impact, or the difference between impact and adaptive capacity can be a little confusing. One way you may wish to think of it is as of 2 homes. Imagine one home has solar panels and battery storage systems, and the other home does not. During a public safety power shutoff, both homes have their PG&E electrical service interrupted. So both homes have the same impact from that loss of electrical service. The home with the solar panels and the batteries is better able to resist that impact. The solar panels and batteries let the home continue to operate and to continue to use its electrical devices. So we would say that the home has a higher adaptive capacity than the one that is not. So the impact score is the same. The home with the solar panels has a higher adaptive capacity, and so we would say that the home with those solar panels would have lower vulnerability. To determine the overall vulnerability, we use a scale of 1 to 5, and that scale is a combination of the impact and adaptive capacity scores. It uses the matrix that you see here. So low impact, high adaptive capacity translates to a vulnerability score of 1. That means minimal vulnerability. High impact and low adaptive capacity translates to a vulnerability score of 5. That's the highest end of the scale. That means severe vulnerability. And it's worth remembering that a score of 1 is minimal. It does not mean there is no vulnerability. There is still some potential for harm. It's just quite small. So with the method, following that method, I can now get into the results. It is worth keeping in mind there are more than 320 individual vulnerability scores as part of this assessment. I encourage you to look to the results spreadsheet that you should have in your packet for the complete set of scores. Certainly there's not time to go over all 320 plus tonight, but I do want to touch on some of the key findings. It probably will not be a big surprise to you to learn that wildfire is likely the hazard of greatest concern to Lafayette, and in particular that senior citizens, persons with limited financial resources, people with limited mobility, and persons with chronic health conditions and disabilities are among those most at risk. And partly, certainly from wildfires, but also from other hazards. And the reasons for that are many. These individuals can face challenges evacuating. They may not always have the resource or the means to adequately prepare their homes. They may not have access to financial resources that will let them effectively rebuild or recover. Persons with chronic or underlying health conditions or other physiological or mental or behavioral issues may also have difficulty with preparation, with evacuation, and they may be more susceptible to some of the health impacts of hazards than other members of the Lafayette population. Many of the single-family homes in Lafayette are located in areas that are subject to elevated risks of wildfire, landslides, and hazards, or landslides and flooding. So there are significant risks from those hazards. We found that the electrical lines in Lafayette are particularly at risk of damage or disruption during climate hazards. That is, and in addition to that, there's also the risk of severe weather creating public safety power shutoffs. So even if the infrastructure is not physically damaged, there is still that risk of service disruption. Many of the outdoor activities in and around Lafayette, hiking, biking, and so on, those are threatened by extreme heat and wildfire events. There are potential impacts to the local economy as a result. And then among the natural resources in and around the community, many of them are affected in one way or another. We have found that creeks and riparian areas are those that are expected to be the most vulnerable as a whole. Again, this is the very high level, quick summary. I do encourage you all to look at the complete sheets in your packet for the more comprehensive presentation of the results. So what we're asking from you all tonight is whether the summary that I presented and the more specific findings that are in the agenda packets, first of all, if they make sense. You all know Lafayette very well. You all have very deep understanding of the community. Do the scores seem reasonable and appropriate for the community? And if not, if a score should be changed, should the score be raised? Should it be lowered? And if you think so, is it because there is a change to the impact consideration or a change to the adaptive capacity consideration, or both? These scores are not produced via a firm mathematical model, so there is always opportunity to revise them to make sure they reflect the community's understanding. Also, the scores that we have identified as being highly or severely vulnerable, those with a score of 4 or 5, those will be carried forward into the safety element as the priority vulnerabilities. They are not certainly the only ones that the safety element will address. We want to make sure that we are addressing all vulnerabilities in the community that we are able to. But those with a score of 4 or 5, those are the high priority ones that might get more attention, more room in the safety element. They might be recommended for greater resources channeled in their direction. So we do want to make sure that this list makes sense to the community, or whether any should be added or removed. Just to remind the GPAC and to go back to the schedule we were talking about earlier, while we work on finalizing the vulnerability assessment over the next month or so, we are also preparing for a public workshop on the safety element and the vulnerability assessment that will be next Tuesday, the 24th. Members of the public will be invited and encouraged to weigh in on these results, to discuss their feelings about hazards and safety in the community, and to provide some initial thoughts about what the Lafayette should do about these vulnerabilities and other safety-related challenges. Simultaneous to the process of the vulnerability assessment, we have been working on other background information, including mapping. And as we mentioned earlier, our goal is to have a draft of the safety element available for members of the public to review by the end of March, with an intention of having the safety element be ready for adoption by the City Council in June. And with that, we would be happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Nice presentation. Appreciate it, Eli. Why don't we start off with questions from the team, and after we go through all the questions with everybody, Then we'll have the public chime in, and then we'll come back to GPAC and give more specific feedback to Eli and to Renata at that time. So let's start with the questions. Susie, I've got you up first, so go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. So I actually have two, they kind of piggyback on each other. So the groups that are deemed as vulnerable, is this just based on past studies, or have we gotten community feedback? Have we done any kind of survey or something where these groups self-identify and say, yes, this would be difficult given these circumstances?
They are based on a combination of studies, various peer-reviewed science that's come out, guidance from the state and from a number of NGOs and nonprofits, particularly those in the Bay Area that have worked with these groups. They are also based on the programs, policies, resources, plans that are present in Lafayette. So it's a combination of regional and statewide understanding of these vulnerabilities combined with these specific considerations that are present in the community. We have not yet done surveys or specific engagement with individual community members, but that's part of what we hope to do at next Tuesday's meeting.
Okay, good. So that will be brought up. And then to follow up on that, so once that's determined, I guess a plan will then go into place of how we can best serve these community members to make sure that those vulnerabilities are addressed.
That is certainly the hope. You know, we want to make sure that the priority vulnerabilities that are identified in this assessment are addressed through the safety element and carried forward into other city planning processes as applicable.
Thank you.
I'd like to tack on too and say that you'll notice that all of the populations listed in the vulnerability assessment were the ones that GPAC reviewed and identified in the list of hazards, assets, and populations in December. So we
Right, I did notice that. I
public-
was just wondering kind of how they
How they
self-identified or if it was perceived because of their group. So I was just curious.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susie. Greg, welcome. I forgot to welcome you earlier. My apologies. We're glad you're joined us. And I'll let you ask your questions.
I have two questions, and this, I'm the planning commissioner rep, and in order to understand the impact, I really need a better feel for the scope. Specifically, what I'm addressing is planning commission responsibility ends at the city lines. But here, if we're to address impact for most of, what are we concerning about Moraga? There's only 5 ways out of Moraga. Let's forget about Canyon because no one's going to evacuate through that. The other 4 are narrow 2-lane roads, no shoulders, trees, 3 of which go through Lafayette. So if we're considering the impact on Lafayette, are we considering evacuation from Moraga? Anybody who remembers pre-COVID what the traffic was like St. Mary's College graduation day knows how busy those streets can get. So that's my first question. My second question is regarding vulnerability. At my current job, I'm a civil structural engineer. Everything in Santa Rosa that was destroyed by the wildfires outside of Sonoma County, outside of Santa Rosa, came across my desk. And one of the big problems was loss of cell phone towers. It doesn't take, a smaller fire can knock out a single cell phone tower. So in the question regarding vulnerability, do we have any information regarding redundancy of cell phone coverage? Because a lot of the county warning systems and stuff is cell phone based. And if we don't have cell phone coverage, that increases vulnerability in getting the message out to effective residents. So thank you.
I can respond to the first question around, the impacts of neighboring communities. So a lot of our discussion to this point about the safety element has been kind of clarifying how the safety element is a high level policy document. And it's not an evacuation plan. It references evacuation plans. It references the local hazard mitigation plan, but it is not that level of detail of evacuation times or routes, we they talk to each other, but they're separate. So as an example, the level of detail in the safety element is there might be a program that says the city will create and maintain emergency communication systems, but we're not creating a decision tree about how and when messages go out. So it's much, much higher up. And we have other documents like our wildfire evacuation plan, Zone Haven, and our more our technical expertise on those matters are living in more dynamic places than the general plan. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'll look to Eli maybe to speak to the vulnerability of cell coverage.
Yeah, to the topic of cell phone towers, I appreciate you bringing that up because it is critical. We do have in the vulnerability assessment communication facilities and communication services identified as assets of consideration, and that does include cell phone towers. The scores for those assets are, if I remember correctly, middling to high. If you think they should be revised, that is certainly the kind of feedback that we'd be looking for, but they are part of the assessment. We are not able to get, this is not meant to be an engineering analysis. We're not getting into the very specific considerations of individual cell phone towers and their capacity and their capabilities. But we are trying to look at them at a relatively general level, considering where they are in and around the community to the best of our abilities.
Thank you.
Greg, anything else? Okay, great, thank you. Christine, you're up next. Christine, you got
Hi
it.
there.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm here. Hi there. Sorry I was late today. Thank you for the presentation. I had a couple questions. One of them is, I know that we did the categories, for example, populations and assets, and we did agree on those at our last meeting. However, after studying the short amount of time I got to study these spreadsheets, I noticed a few things that I don't think should be put into these categories. Let's say population and assets, or other things should be added perhaps. Are these categories written in stone now, or are we still have the opportunity to change them, reword them, or rename them, or add or subtract, or is that too late? Because I know we did this the last meeting. That's one question.
I can start.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
And perhaps Renata can fill in some more detail on this. I'd say changes to the names are certainly quite easy to make. So if there are terms that you feel would better reflect community priorities or the characteristics of the community, I think we're always happy to do that. As far as adding or revising categories, I think there is some capacity to do that. It does mean additional work, and we certainly don't want to delay the schedule given how accelerated it is. I'd say there's ability to make some change, but I would ask the commission to keep in mind that more extensive changes may begin to impact the schedule.
And then when would we bring that up? Would that be something we bring up tonight, or is that something we would wait until the workshop night, or when, if we see something, or one of us sees something that we'd like addressed, would that be a tonight thing for those categories, or is that not appropriate for tonight?
I think
I would
we
say
should
bring
bring
them
them up tonight after we have the public comment, Christine.
Okay.
And then if you think of something later on, because we didn't have a lot of time to review this, just send an email note to Renata.
Okay. Great. So we can talk about it afterwards then. All right, fine. The other question is for the impact summaries for each of those categories. Some of the things in here are not, like, I don't think they don't apply to Lafayette, for example. So that is something we would talk about tonight. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, good. Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Carol, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just have, I have a question, but then I have one little comment. Under where it lists, oh, I just had it here. The list of populations under parks. There's some kind of garden I never heard of. I think that's supposed to be rain garden. Not that like Lucerne garden. I just had it here. Okay, it's on wherever the populations are delineated. Okay, parks and open space, neighborhood parks. Lauren Gardens. I have no idea what that is. I'm sure it should be rain garden. So it's in all wherever there's any delineation of the population. So that should be changed. Then I have a question in the big tables, for instance, the under drought. You have parks and open space, and there's no writing there. There's writing for everything else, but there's no impact summary. And I wondered why.
What page are you referring to?
Well, there are no page numbers, so I don't know.
Okay.
I can't tell you. It's in the big, there are 35 pages. I numbered them in this page 4. But
It's in page 14 of the PDF is where the drought analysis or the drought.
yeah, so I
hazard is
wondered
analyzed.
why it says above, outdoor workers drought can reduce water availability for parks and recreation areas. But and it says talks about kayaking under outdoor, but see, parks and open space, it's just blank. There's no adaptive capacity summary, and there's no impact. And certainly we were totally impacted.
Yeah, I'm sure Eli can provide a little more background.
Yes, I'd be happy to clarify that. So there is a score there, but as you point out, there's no written summary. The way we approach it to try and at least somewhat curtail the length of things, any score that had 4 or 5, we did provide a written summary. Scores of 1, 2, and 3, we provided a written summary where it was felt some additional clarification was needed. In the case of parks and open space for drought, the score is 3, and we did not feel that we needed to really go into a lot of explanation as to why that would be the case. So that is why those written summaries are blank. If you would like us to provide a written summary for that or for any others, we certainly can. We're just trying to avoid inundating you with too much text.
Okay, because same thing under oak woodlands, there's nothing, but under grassland there is.
Right.
And then chaparral has nothing, but wetlands and vernal pools do. So I maybe, some other explanation or somewhere. I'm sure we go on a workshop, people are going to wonder why all those things are blank.
So we could also add an explainer as to what Eli just pointed out in the front of the document as to why there are blanks. But again, if you want there to be an explanation, something we can cover in the discussion later.
Yeah, I think there should be, because for oak woodlands is nothing, but grassland is. It says drought may harm annual and perennial grasses. Well, it also harms oak woodlands. So, I mean, it's sort of.
And so the score captures that impact. It's not saying that there isn't any, it's just, I think it's more clear maybe that the ways in which oak woodlands are impacted by drought as opposed to grasslands.
Well, same thing for chaparral. To me, that's a scrub. But then riparian areas has a big explanation. Okay. Just like to point that out, so Parks and Rec notices that.
Okay. Anything else, Carol?
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Stella?
Thank you. I was also having some I guess it's slowing me down what Carol had mentioned about just some of the cells not having anything written in them, because I was looking for kind of the reasons for some rankings. But one of the other issues I had, which I want to ask about here, is in the table, in the matrix with all of the descriptions, I don't see the section for flooding, which of course was on my mind given what we've gone through in the past month. And so I wonder if it's omitted or if I just missed it. What I see goes from
I think
extreme to human health hazards.
Yeah, they mislabeled it.
Oh, yes, I see. Okay,
Yeah. So,
thank you.
it should be flooding. It should be flooding, and they labeled it as human health hazards. So that's just a typo.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I will go back and do my homework and read that. Thank you.
Apologies, we'll correct
Any other
that.
questions? Stella?
It's okay. I just I use the find function in the electronic documents, and so I was bouncing around looking for flooding and didn't find it. Okay. I have a bunch of questions, but I'm wondering if they would be for after public comment, things like when we get into the details of some of the impacts and the vulnerability scores. Is that right?
If it's a question, ask it now. If you want to leave later for just direction and feedback, we can wait that until after public comment. That's up to you, Stella.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess I just have. Well, let me tell you what, basically, generally what I have, and you can tell me if this is the right time or not. I looked through the very basic matrix that just said, is this population or entity vulnerable or not? And I had some thoughts where it says no, and I thought, well, maybe I think it is vulnerable. So that's at the highest level, which then, of course, cascades down into the deeper levels of analysis. And so I'm not really sure how I should proceed. If this is too much in the weeds and I should be sending this in more of a written comment. I want to be cognizant that our meeting is limited in time.
Yeah, what I might recommend, Stella, with your concurrence is, if it's a significant piece of feedback, let's bring it up after the public comment. If it is in a minor category, it should be no. Right now it's yes. I'm sure that Eli and Renata can take that offline in an email, but I'm going to leave that up to you in terms of which ones you think are the priority to bring up in this forum.
Okay, that seems reasonable. I guess I have one question for Renata and Eli, and that is for a bunch of the infrastructure items. Did Lafayette Public Works give input as to their assessment of the impacts and hazards, or the impact from the hazards on, say, for example, their stormwater systems?
Not yet, but we can certainly circulate it there.
Okay. All right, I think that's all for me now. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. I don't see any other hands up. I've got a couple of questions. Eli, on the list of hazards, on the extreme heat and warm nights, you talk about a definition of what those are. How many of those a year do we actually have? And is it a number that's increasing?
The historical average is about 4 extreme heat days per year. The number has been increasing. I don't have that exact number in front of me right now, but we can certainly get it. Warm nights,
Okay.
there tend to be somewhat more of them per year. They also have been increasing, and we can get those numbers for you if you would like.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the magnitude of the impact. You know, four nights a week doesn't sound like a lot to me. But I think if we could quantify it, I think it'll help the policymakers later on make better decisions in terms of magnitude.
Yes, and it
On the
is
power
quantified.
shut-off,
It is quantified in, I believe it's written up in the hazards, populations, and assets memo. If it's not there, it certainly will be in the technical background information that will accompany the safety element.
okay. On the power shutoff piece, are you taking into account the trend that PG&E is getting a little bit better at localizing these power shutoffs, or are you basing it on when they started this program, how broad those shutoffs were?
A little of both. You know, PG&E has gotten a lot better since 2018. There are a lot fewer of them, but at the same time, we recognize, you know, just because they've gotten better over the past few years doesn't mean there couldn't be some change to either the climate conditions or to regulatory framework that might cause it to sort of seesaw back the other way. So I would say we are approaching them anticipating somewhat fewer than we were seeing in 2018, but keeping in mind the possibility that they may get more frequent than what we've seen, say, over the past year or two.
Okay. I think my final question is, you listed a number of populations, but there's no numbers associated with it. It was difficult for me to understand the magnitude. So for example, you talk about the homeless population, and in Lafayette, I believe by the last census, we're talking about 4 or 5 people. Not to minimize the impact on those 4 or 5 people, but it's not a large population. On the other end of the scale, you've got people that are older, and that's in Lafayette, a larger population. Do you have a methodology to weigh the populations, and that might make us feel, from a policy standpoint, might make us feel differently about how we react to ones that are weighted higher because it's a larger population versus ones that are quite small?
We do not do that because this is meant to be looking at individual populations and assets, and we don't want to start. It's meant to be sort of confined to the effects of that individual population. You know, we don't want to try and, as you were saying, you know, suggest that because of a smaller population size, they are somehow, you know, less vulnerable, or there's less consideration for the city. I think that is a decision that can be made when the policy development phase comes. But at this phase, we are looking at the impact to that individual population, regardless of whether it's, you know, 5 people or 5,000 people. So we're not assessing.
Do we know?
We're not assessing the overall score of all populations in Lafayette. We're looking at these individual groups.
Do we know the size of each of these populations?
We know the size of many, but not all of them.
Okay. Okay, that's all the questions I had. Susie, it looks like you've got another question.
Yes, and I just want to bring this up because as the downtown person, this has been brought up frequently, especially on Nextdoor. But I noticed under hazards, we don't have wildlife. And I don't know if it's fitting or not. Like I said, I just wanted to address it because of the recent coyotes and everything that are frequenting downtown due to the flooding, due to the other things. So because of the climate and environmental factors, we're getting a lot of those. So should that be addressed, or should that be put off for a different type of thing?
We had heard this concern. It was brought up, and I think we did consider it. I
Okay.
think ultimately where the reason why it was not fully included was because it was felt that was a very specific type of concern that was not really appropriate for this higher level of vulnerability assessment or for the safety element.
Right, that's what I was thinking, but like I said, I just wanted to address it because it is
We
being talked about a lot, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly don't want to minimize the magnitude of the issue. We did add a population of households with animals, which is meant to reflect both pets and livestock. So as, if you will, a subset of some of these issues, such as fires or flooding, we are keeping in mind that wildlife patterns may change as a result of hazards, and that people who do have pets or livestock may be impacted as a result.
Okay, I think that's a good solution. Thank you.
And per the suggestion of GPAC, there was also a category of ecosystems and natural resources added for wildlife corridors. So we
Perfect,
did
thanks.
add that in.
Greg, you have another question?
Thank you. Two related things is it inside or outside the scope for what I'll call ancillary things? For example, if we're having flooding, that means we probably had some major storms which knocked down trees, blocked roads, stuff like that. And then similarly, landslides could be triggered by earthquake, which again would dramatically expand or, you know, the scope of the problem. Or is that just something that outside beyond what we can look at?
That is something that we absolutely did include. Those are what we refer to as cascading or compounding impacts. You know, drought dries out the slope, and then a wildfire burns the slope, and then you get a severe storm that floods the slope, and then you get a landslide. You know, there is certainly a chain of events that can happen here. Those are factored into the scoring. They will be, I think, described in greater detail when we get to the write-up. But that is definitely part of how we do things.
Any other questions from GPAC before we go to public comment? Don't see any raised hands. So Renata, I'll ask you to kind of queue up anybody that's online. We have a kind of a small audience tonight, but we'll see if anybody's got any questions or comments from the public.
If you would like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. There are no hands raised.
Okay. Oh, Rob LaVoy just raised his hand.
Yep, I will promote Rob LaVoy.
Hi, Rob, welcome. You got in right under the wire.
Thank you. I didn't realize there were so few people ready to comment. I wanted to agree with Matt's request for some data on these different population groups. I think, you know, with all of our limited time and so much data to try and cover, it just seems like we shouldn't be focusing on things that aren't really relevant or critical for our town. And so the priority should be focusing on things that really have a significant impact. So if there's several hundred seniors that would be impacted by something, then we should be focusing on that. And versus if there's 4 homeless people, like I said, I don't want to minimize their situation, but it's not so much of a problem in Lafayette. And also, you know, the heat days, if we have 4 hot days a year, which is about the number of times I run my air conditioner, that's, you know, it's not something that's necessarily super critical. So I don't know what the ranking is for that, but it should reflect the likelihood of occurrence. And if Eli has some data on, you know, the increase in this, I haven't seen it. I'd like to see that data showing a significant increase in the number of heat days per year. Let's see. It seems like, can somebody explain to me, it seems like everything, all these problems and challenges are being assigned to climate change. And to me, it seems like most of them are just naturally occurring in our arid California climate. You know, we live in a place where it doesn't rain for 9 months a year. So anyway, if somebody can explain that, I'd appreciate it. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you signing on and giving your comments. Anybody else? I don't see any hands up, but let's give it a second.
Do not see any.
Okay, well,
hands
we will
raised.
end the, we will end the public comments, and we will bring it back to GPAC. And what I'd like to do now, we're doing pretty well on time. It's the top of the hour, is for feedback and suggestions. And then also, maybe Eli, if you can, maybe if you can address Rob's question. I know that can get a fairly deep, complex one. So if you want to defer on that, I would certainly understand. But I'll give you some time to think about that. But from a feedback standpoint, I think I see Christine's hand up first, and then Jim Cervantes. So Christine, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm going to lower my hand. There we go. Lower hand. Okay. So I know that, you know, we all made a decision about the assets sections, for example, the categories. But I really, after looking at all of the documents and all the bigger document, deeper level, I feel like we need to make a few changes. So I've got some little things in here that are just sort of nitpicky. Like, for example, under the assets, households and poverty, you know, the notes about it, it has this households with an income below the poverty level, which is blah, blah, blah. Can we, for things that changes, like little things, like I think it should say of people in the Contra Costa County, right? To be more specific. Or, for example, overcrowded households. What does that mean? Is that bedrooms or rooms? And I think this kind of thing does need to be clear for the public when they come in for next week, so that they understand what they're looking at as well. So for little tiny changes like that, would that be something I would just write to you guys about, or do you just want me to tell you what they are now? There's not many.
What would be most useful? Yeah, Renata, what would be most useful for you and the staff?
I'll let Eli jump in if I'm misguiding, but I think if it's kind of a terminology change rather than like a substantive content change, we could handle that offline. But I would ask that we, you know, check the definitions, the list definitions, because that might answer some questions. But yeah, we're happy to take that feedback over email.
So I'll do that separately just to make it easy for everyone else. I do have an issue though with one that I think we should talk about real quick is under the assets, there's renters in there as their own category. And I cannot remember why that is there. I feel like that's sort of unnecessary because all the groups are being covered, you know, all different kinds of groups are being covered under the different categories, you know, like low income households or persons, you know, who are single, or, you know, all these other things. So is that, why is renters in there?
Renters are included because renters do not have the ability, generally speaking, to upgrade or make changes or to retrofit or harden their homes the way that a homeowner does. And that can expose them to a higher level of vulnerability. And renters often include groups of individuals who do not fall into those other categories. To give an example, I am a renter. You know, I don't fall into these other population groups. I cannot protect myself against extreme heat because I cannot install an air conditioner in my home. And that does affect my adaptive capacity. A homeowner would be able to do that, a renter cannot. So that we do want to make sure that we're not excluding the more limited availability of renters given their lack of control over their housing situation.
Okay, then I would like to add low-income homeowners in there because there are seniors, many of them actually where I live, that aren't able to do the same thing because they just don't have the finances for it. So I think that puts them in a particular situation as well. So can we add that in there?
I would point out we do have
Christina-
low-income households as a population.
Well, wouldn't those people who are renters be low-income households already in a different category?
Not necessarily. Not some renters may not be considered low income.
All right, I'll think about that. The other thing is too, under buildings and infrastructure, I would really like to add in there, I see we have single family residents, we have multifamily residents, and then especially for my area and probably Jim's as well, I would like to add rural or semi-rural neighborhoods, because I think those are going to be impacted differently than, just maybe a closer single family zone neighborhood or multifamily zone neighborhood closer to town. So can we add in another buildings and infrastructure setting for them? So a rural or semi-rural neighborhoods or something to that effect.
There is. There
It is
is a
different.
category for persons living on single access roads.
I don't think that's good enough. I think it really needs to be more rural. Because we have it's different, right? I mean, they're not single access roads. I've got people who are up in the hills here on Hunsaker Canyon. That's a two-way road, part of it. And, it
Well,
attaches to a two-way road, but it's not, I don't know. Maybe Jim can fill in on that too, but I feel like we've just got different concerns too, a little bit different. I know it's kind of touched upon in different sections, like for example, livestock, but I just feel like I don't want to not have that in there because I do think we do have semi-rural areas and more rural areas that I don't want to leave out.
Yeah, I think.
What does Jim think about that?
What?
Jim, you've got the rural out there.
Jim, what do you think? Jim, you're on mute.
Thank you. This kind of segues into one of my comments here. So I don't know, if, Christine, if you want to finish your points and then I can get it in mine.
All right, so that's the one that if you'll bring that one back up again.
Yeah.
Let's see, the other one I was thinking of too, and I wish David from the Creeks Commission was here, but I almost wonder if we should separate creeks and riparian because some of the creeks aren't going to be riparian and would have different issues. And I was thinking too, after these big floods, I'm wondering if the state, I'm just wondering if we're going to have to change the form of the river or of the streams and creeks here, and they're going to be less environmentally natural. We're going to have to put maybe cement or, whatever they do to strengthen because we lost St. Mary's Road, right? We lost a whole side of the creek at St. Mary's Road. And so I wonder if we should split those up into creeks separately from riparian environments or habitats, because it's really two different things for some issues that I think we're going to have to address at some point, and it wouldn't be necessarily a riparian environment problem. It's going to be, we're going to have to fill the whole thing with cement and make a, whatever. So is that something that we should think about?
Eli, any thoughts on that?
I suppose I would ask if we could get a little clarification as to why that seems necessary, because a riparian area, as I've always understood it, by definition, creeks are riparian areas. So I guess I would be curious as to why you believe it would be helpful that we make that separation.
Well, I think we have like 26 miles of creek or something like that, but that's the waterways that are very important and necessary and natural here. But I feel like the more urban we get, that, we're going to have problems with, with the slides of the creek sides going down into the water, because we're going to have these events again. And I just, I don't know if that's something we should consider, because it's, at some point, I think the environment's going to become second of importance when, I've got streets with St. Mary's Road, like I said. I mean, that whole thing, they had to, I don't know what they did for the repair, but it took out a whole chunk of the side there. So I guess maybe it would be covered in a utility or some other section here where that would be discussed. But I think at some point there needs to be should we be concerned about protecting certain riparian areas, and then the other ones would be, we would allow or think about how we would treat those areas that we would have to sacrifice and just either cement over or change the routing of it, or I guess some of it's utilitarian, right? So maybe that's what it's getting covered under. Is that what it is?
So we could take this to, along with the, we could take this to Public Works to get their feedback on that potentially, and bring that back.
Okay, yeah, I just feel like we have to look at that in two different ways. Not that I want to, I would like to keep it environmentally the way it is, but I'm just afraid that it might not be able to stay that way. And if that's the case, I think we need to be able to address that. And then let's see, so that, and then I can't see the last one. So the little stuff I'll just go over with you privately. I did have one though that I wanted to be taken out right away. Is there's this thing on low income households and for impact summary of drought. And it says that low resource people of color for the impact summary, I don't know, it doesn't have a page number, but low resource people of color may be less likely to afford water. Price changes to mandatory water conservation measures due to income constraints. And then it says this population is also more likely to have existing water quality issues, which may worsen the lower water levels. And I don't think that's applicable for us, because nobody in this area would be having water that's, like Flint, Michigan or something like that. And if we did, we'd all have that. So if we could take that out, I think that would be good. And then the other thing is too, you might want to look into, this might be a program, but I looked at East Bay Mud, and some of the adaptive capacity summary for the drought could include, and probably should, that there are, for low income people, there are reduced billing available to them. They can get assistance from East Bay Mud. So I just wanted to make sure that, that's in there too. So they can have financial aid or financial help with their water bills. So anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Carl, I'm going to let you jump in here because you've been pounding on the screen there a little bit. It looks like you had something to add to the discussion that Christine brought up.
Yeah, I just want to jump in as your liaison. All the miles of creeks in Lafayette are riparian. And actually, from a policy standpoint, even if they're in a concrete channel, we like to continue to identify them as riparian, just so we can continue to require or request riparian vegetation along those corridors. So there's an important value in keeping that as one.
Thank you, Carl. Jim, you're up next.
Thank you, Chair Pease. I was kind of, I was going through the materials and the really detailed stuff which I picked up yesterday, and I was sort of struggling with this, trying to figure out how can I provide meaningful feedback, and because there's a lot here, and many of these categories to me just seem to overlap, where they're almost synonymous, and it sort of felt like it's not a criticism, it's just an observation that we're going out to the fourth decimal point where maybe you should be rounding to 10 with some of this. That's kind of what it felt to me. And maybe part of this is just trying to sort of be mindful of what's in SB 379 so that we come up with a product that, whoever who might be looking at this can say, yep, we checked the box, you're good. So maybe we stick with the categories. But here's, for example, kind of what I was struggling with, where we've got cost burden households, households in poverty, low income households, low resource people of color. I mean, a lot of those are sort of like overlapping where, so for example, in some of these where, I don't know, pick one, extreme heat, we've got cost burden households are V3, households of poverty V5. Okay, maybe there's a differential there. You could see that. Low income households V3, and low resource people of color V5. I'm thinking, you know, if they're like 80%, if they're almost synonymous, it's like you'd think they'd be the same. I mean, and maybe there's a nuance there I'm missing. Maybe you round up, you know, for someone who is houses in poverty versus cost burdened. But at some point, it's like they all, I was just wondering if it's possible to simplify this. And again, I understand if we're trying to check boxes with some state agency, we keep the terms because maybe that's what they're used to looking at. I guess what I would do when I've got more time would be to maybe provide suggestions as to where we might want to adjust these, but I wouldn't want to get into that at this meeting. It would just take us forever. So that's just an observation. I'm kind of maybe coming at this from a different angle than Christine, which is, if anything, I'd want to sort of like collapse some of these categories as opposed to adding more, because there's so many right now. It's just hard for me to really keep track. And, you know, to Christine's point, and I think it's a good one with respect, and I think about what we've been certainly dealing with over the last several weeks here in my neck of the woods. We've had drainage issues and all sorts of stuff, but I think that's captured under the flood control and stormwater. Don't think we need to add another category there. And I think that whereas other types of utilities are in the purview of Central Sand or East Bay Mud, storm drains are kind of our problem. And for our neighbors in Moraga, a huge problem. And I think there'll be a bigger problem for us maybe going forward. So I don't know. I guess if these are the right categories for purposes of the parties that are looking at this, I'm fine with it. I think though, then that some of the categorization would be pretty much they'd be the same, because they're, to me, that many of these categories overlap a lot. I think what I'll do is I'm going to go through this more thoroughly and send in, you know, my comments. I'll send them to you, Renata, because I think getting into every single line item would be sticking pins in our eyeballs after a point. So I want to spare you all from that. And with that, I do want to say I do appreciate the effort that went into this. Is a lot. And the PlaceWorks folks, I think, did a lot of work in doing this. I'm just thinking of, from my side, how do I provide meaningful feedback without going on ad infinitum? So thank you, Chair Peace, which is like glad I'm saying it's chair someone else than me. So thank you all.
And
Thank
Chair,
you, former Chair.
if I might jump in,
yeah.
there were a
Go ahead,
couple of
Renata.
guiding questions in the PowerPoint for feedback, and if it would be helpful at all for GPAC for us to pull that back up, we are happy to as well.
Okay. Yeah, why don't you put that up, Renata, just so people can reference it. And while you're doing that, I'll go to Chris Lee, who's got her hand up.
Thank you. Sorry to be late. I had a meltdown with Zoom on my laptop, but here I am. Kind of seconding Jim's point about collapsing the categories, and also want to talk more about what Christine brought up. Over the last couple of weeks, we have a creek behind our house, and the way that it works legally is that our property goes out to the middle of the creek, which of course changes, not on a daily basis, but it does change. And it was a very scary thing to think that somebody's lack of caretaking of their part of the creek further upstream might result in flooding for us. And I'm still trying to figure out how would that work legally if they're personally liable for keeping their part of the creek clean and they don't. and it damages other people's properties. Do you sue them? I have no idea. So I think that as a bigger issue, I know this isn't the purview of the safety element discussion, but just in terms of things working better in the city with people who do have creeks in their backyards or their side yards, that we start to be very mindful of the fact that this can easily cause flooding, which is, of course, it's part of the safety element. Because I'm not sure that is true everywhere. I'm not sure people would be personally responsible for a flooding incident. Maybe Orinda has that, I'm not sure. So I just kind of want to toss that out, that it's more personal than people might realize, the consequences of not taking care of your side of the creek. I don't know how you solve that.
Most aren't even aware of that obligation.
That was my fear.
That's my experience as a real estate lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we've got corrugated metal fencing thrown into the other side of our creek. We tend to keep our creeks pretty clear, and we plant riparian plants to try to keep the erosion down. Another part of what happened to us was that the silt from up above is now, in our creek, which makes it a little more difficult for the water to run the way it used to. So that's something we actually are responsible for taking care of. And that just seems like a huge burden. We're not soil engineers. We don't understand.
It seems like these are issues that are important, particularly as we start to get into the policies, which are the next level down.
Uh-huh.
Is that kind of what you're referring to? Okay.
Yeah, I guess I am, because I think what we're trying to do in the overview is to identify what the issues are around safety and try to mitigate them. And I think this situation with the creeks being private property is kind of outside the I can't think of another safety issue that goes this way.
Hey,
Yeah,
Eli,
I
would you
think
mind
this
dropping the
would be-
slide? Oh, sorry.
I think this would be a good discussion on the February 22nd meeting, where we get into the policies, goals, and the programs, where we could talk about the specifics at that point.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Is that
Oh, yeah.
okay?
Yeah, because it started to get discussed, and I thought, well, I really do need to mention this because it's just very different from other mitigations.
Right. Anything else, Kirsten?
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mason.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on both Chris Lee's and Christine Rasmussen's comment. First, Chris Lee's, if we are going to consider people our asset, I think, and I apologize if this information is readily available, just taking the creeks, for example, it's not like you can just go down and clean out a creek. There's fish and game,
Yes.
there's flood control, there's neighbors. If you are going to list people as assets on a policy standpoint, it might be nice to have, some place where they can go to see who to contact.
Mhm.
And because that crosses state and federal and just neighborhood privacy issues. The second thing I want to, and maybe this is buried someplace else, I wanted to follow up on Christine Rasmussen's comment about separating out rural versus semi-rural. Take the Hunsaker Canyon, for example. I'm not going to pretend if there was a problem that they would get the same level of attention as Burton Valley. And to the fact to if they didn't, that would if they got a more delayed response because it's more rural or more semi-rural, that would increase the impact because they would be isolated longer than, say, somebody that's, you know, across the street from Burton Valley. Now, maybe that information is buried in there somewhere, but I didn't see that, and I wasn't sure to what extent, you know, just overall response times factor into the impact assessments.
Renata, do you want to make a quick comment on that?
I can make a comment on the first piece about the agencies involved and kind of the resources about creeks and creek responsibilities. So the city does have a web page about creek maintenance and homeowner responsibilities, as well as kind of a 3-page trifold brochure about those responsibilities and kind of the, I believe it has resources involved or resources for homeowners. But I think, you know, there is, I think the comment was about kind of agents, information about agency responsibilities and involvement. And I think, you know, there's always more to be done with public information. And I'll make an attempt about the impact on the impact assessment of impact for kind of different communities. And I think the intention behind laying out those hazard assets and populations was to, which some people might think there's too many groups or categories, to be detailed and kind of focus on the impacts of these different areas, and then as compared to the hazards present in Lafayette. And so we're not going through and doing analyses on you know, water levels during flood for all of these hazards as compared to wildfire response times for all of these populations and assets. That's a little bit more technical and detailed than where we're at in that this assessment. So the impact is kind of a broader stroke of how this hazard would affect these populations that GPAC kind of identified earlier on.
That still kind of eludes what I'm asking for. Like, for example, going forward, you know, since a lot of our low-income housing is going to, based on the housing element, is going to go in certain areas. So the impact of these on those populations would actually be less than, say, the impact of flooding or wildfires on, say, the semi-rural people who, for example, using, again, Hunsaker Canyon. So the question revolves around just the basic geography in Lafayette, and that's what seems to be missing from the various the various categories based on income or stuff like that. It's, hey, how fast can we get them back on their feet? And what I'm asking is, how long do they have to be on their own? And I wasn't sure. I didn't see how that was factored in until, you know, Christine Rasmussen raised that whole issue of rural versus semi-rural. They don't, as far as I know, they don't really have a low-income population out there, but at the same time, that could be the events out there could be a disproportionately large impact compared to other areas of the city.
Yeah, so I would argue that actually, you know, low-income households are throughout the community. It's not just those forthcoming through new multifamily development. Seniors who are on fixed income are considered low-income households. There are other folks in the city who aren't making, you know, the median that is in Lafayette. So it's, you know, we can do mapping of, but I think that the geography comes into play with the hazards, right? So we know where the wildfire risk is, we know where the flooding risk is, but those areas impacted differently by those hazards. It's not even about rural or semi-rural, right? We have established more suburban character areas that are still share the same risks as Hunsaker Canyon in a lot of ways.
Okay, well, tell you what, why don't we do this? You've gotten some good feedback here, Renata, and Eli, why don't you take some consideration of it, and on the next meeting, report back on that. I want to make sure we get to everybody as we're at 7:30 now. So Hannah, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know you've got it. There you go.
Cut out a little bit.
Go ahead, Emma. What's your feedback?
Yeah, well, just adding on to what Jim and Christine said earlier, I think, you know, limiting some of these populations would be helpful to make it more cohesive. I think just looking at the extreme heat evaluation, one of the groups is people without a high school degree, which I think is supposed to sort of, I think for the most part, reflect the more lower paying jobs, but then again, you have low income people as a group already. And then also, I think, who said it earlier? Oh, Susie mentioned earlier, like adding in wildlife to the more like ecological section of this report. And I was also thinking about adding an endangered species, because I did briefly look at the Arinda report and I did include that. So I don't know, maybe that's for later though.
Okay. Anything else, Emma?
Oh no, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Beth Needle, you're up next.
Oh, hi, thanks. I'm going to flip to the more concrete side of Lafayette. I've been looking at building and infrastructure, and both for Renata and Eli, I'm just curious to see how you came up with these numbers, if you worked with anybody from CityWorks to, to determine extreme heat effects, for example, or flood effects on major buildings downtown. For example, the library is the go-to place in heat. We often lose power and we lose Comcast. And so the infrastructure that supports the downtown corridor and supports community center, the library, the police department, don't always work really well. So I, be glad to sit with Mike or whomever, but I'm just curious to see how you came up with these numbers, because my experience is a little different. That's it.
Okay, thank you.
If I might, if you have specific
Go ahead,
feedback about adjusting those scores in either the adaptive capacity or impact, we'd be happy to talk through that in greater detail.
Okay, that'd be great.
Thank you, Beth. Stella.
Thank you. I'm just going to, I think, limit my comments to the yes, no spreadsheet or matrix, because there were a few no's where I questioned that. And so because of the structure of the report, anything that's currently a no did not get analyzed in the remainder. And so one that I wanted to bring up was in populations, persons living on single access roads is a no for drought. And what struck me was that there have been the effects of stress on trees due to the drought. And perhaps, I'm not sure about this, but I wonder if there have been more falling, perhaps not even in the flooding time, but even in the dry time that we've had, that would definitely impact people living on single access roads. Another that I wonder about, and this is kind of related to my question earlier, before public comment about whether Public Works has reviewed the really the entirety of these hazards and mainly buildings and infrastructure, as well as I think, some of the ecosystems like the creeks, since that is a flood control for us. But that is major roads and highways also doesn't have a drought impact. And there's one very specific thing that I'll just mention here. Maybe Renata can take this to back to Mike, which is the Highway 24 has been having some really strange warbling bumps that seem to kind of be a problem. I mean, I think everyone's noticed that, right? Somewhere between the 680 and really more from Pleasant Hill Road out to downtown maybe exit and a little beyond. I just want, I've been on my mind to ask Mike, the city engineer, is this because of the drought? Is there something in this roadway that's being affected by this? So I just want to throw that out there. And then the last thing that I have is on the flooding risk. We've had a unprecedented month of just incredible rainfall. And we've had flooding in places, I think, where we didn't expect it, region-wide, but possibly even within Lafayette. And so I'm just wondering if the assessment that we see here was made before January and what we've seen, and if maybe there are some changing thoughts about the impact of flooding on these populations and assets. I guess that's a question for Eli.
Yes, I'd be happy to. I appreciate all of that. The flooding, the analysis in its entirety was done and has been reviewed and revised, as recently as a few days ago. So the recent floods that we've seen over the past month or so, those are the types of events that we do expect to become more frequent with climate change. These are, very much a harbinger of things to come. So those are considered in the scoring. That said, if you feel that the scoring does not appropriately reflect your own experiences and what you've seen in Lafayette recently, we would certainly welcome that feedback and any suggestions about how those scores can be changed.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think mainly the predominant area that I saw was, well, everything in the matrix is yes for impact from flooding, except in the buildings and infrastructure group. And that's where I just thought, well, really, I think schools is marked as no, but they probably do have some risk of flooding. And so the question is, should they be included in the assessment? I think parks and open space is another, which, and I guess maybe it's not exactly flooding. We definitely have had landslide problems in the Briones Regional Park within the city, but again, there's just a number of items, assets in the buildings and infrastructure that are no, that I just question. So I think maybe what I should do is just maybe write up some comments and thoughts and then pass those on through Renata. I do also have a number of specific items with respect to the summary matrix and the actual vulnerability scores. And I know that's a question you've asked us to give you feedback on today, but I feel kind of just like Jim mentioned, there's a lot and I want to be cognizant of time. And so I think it may be most productive if I just write those up and send them to you this weekend. Because you have given us a lot to read and it's good content. So thank you.
Anything else, Stella?
No, thank you.
Okay, Christine, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, so all the input you're getting now, these are just suggestions and everyone, I mean, is a change is going to be made or are they just being brought under consideration for a later meeting, or how do we go forward with this? I mean, I feel pretty strongly about my semi-rural and rural, so I want to make sure that, I really do think that needs another category. At the same time, I agree with the other speakers that, we need to pare this down because it's like, I feel like we're saying we've broken it down to such detail for some things and then other things not. So I feel like we need to come to some sort of agreement on what we feel is like adequate. So the suggestions given were, perhaps in populations, we should pare it down a little because it's too many, which I also agree with. So is that something that's going to be taken into consideration and changed, or are we gonna have another meeting about this, or how are we proceeding with these suggestions right now?
Yep, so as we discussed at the top of the meeting, there will be multiple reviews, this being the first. We'll be taking this to the public workshop on Tuesday for additional feedback. Based on the feedback received from the public during the workshop, and once Eli and I have a chance to review the comments here tonight and any others that come from GPAC, between now and next week, we'll work through revisions, and we'll reach out if any questions come up to clarify kind of the suggestions or questions therein. But we'll be again revisiting this in February during our February meeting. We'll bring back a revised version for feedback. So there's a month of discussion, but again, we do want to make sure we have some clarity so we can move on the key vulnerabilities that will focus on the rules, policies, and programs.
And then, so if we think there's a certain hazard or, something that should be changed, the score itself, like moved from a 4 to a 3, for example, or a V3 to a 4, that would be something I can just write you a note about.
Sure, you can bring it up now, but yeah, if you need more time to consider it, yeah, we'd like a little more direction as to why that should be changed.
I see.
In one direction or another. Yeah.
Well, since you asked, I think I would like to see the parks and open space and outdoor recreation section. So in the building and infrastructure, economic drivers, they both came out as vulnerability scores of V3. I don't know what page number this is. I'd like to see those moved up to V4s because I think, the climate change, drought, and heat, as well as fires can really impact those. And I really want to make sure it gets its credit for something that we really need to consider highly when we do our policies. And then I like Emma's idea about getting species that are, we have to watch for extinction and that are highly vulnerable. I'd like to put that on our list as well. I think that was a great idea, good suggestion. And the persons living on single access roads, I once again would like to have categories of rural, semi-rural, and I do want those put up for wildfire up to 5s. I don't know why this is V4. And severe storms, V5. I want all of mine moved up for those two. And then also I have to say for flooding, also moving them up to a V4 or 5, just because we've got these creeks. So I'd like to see that all.
Okay, I'm having a little hard time tracking the hazard and the population that you're asking to be changed. So maybe if we could write it up actually, since there were several, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, anything for me that involves evacuation is going to be higher. What's that?
Yeah, Christine, if you could put that in writing and send it off to Renata, I think it's going to be a lot more productive. They can react to it a lot better than trying to write this all down because you're coming at it pretty fast.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol.
Thank you. I'd like to go back to Christine's question. How will all these comments and the public comments be presented to us? Will we get a red line version of they're in or they're out because of, some reason? How are we going to, how is this all going to be presented to GPAC?
Well, that's a great question, Carol. I think it depends on the scope and scale of the changes. So it remains to be seen, but I think we'll do our best to make it as easily comprehensible to understand what was changed throughout the process. So that might be red lines, or it might be a summary. I think there's still a lot of feedback to be received, and so I'm not sure what the scope of the changes will be.
So we would get to vote on some of it that is just opinion of people?
I would say we'll bring it back for discussion. The revised vulnerability assessment, we'll bring it back for discussion in the end of February after we've had a chance to incorporate suggestions. And at that point, folks can chime in on how, with their feedback and or that of their commission, whatever it might be.
Okay,
Makes sense?
thank you.
All right.
Yeah, I think, Carol, once we get feedback from the public, I think with staff, we can assess how many changes we've got to make and how do we track those. And if we've got to have an extra meeting to maybe vote and discuss on these, we can do that. But I think we need an opportunity to hear from the public more next week. And then we can figure out what's the best way to track all of this.
Yeah, I understand that. I was just wondering, what Christine was talking about. How do the changes get made? I understand if they are changes that cannot be made by law or the, expert opinion. But what about those that are just suggestions that, could be made or could not be made? Don't we get a vote on these?
Now is the time to discuss if anyone has varying opinions. This is the GPAC discussion.
Well, that could get very lengthy, I think.
That's up to the team if they want to go late on this, or do we want to give staff a chance to kind of put this together with public input next week and then come back to you with what this looks like, and then we can decide how much time we want to spend on it. Is that maybe an approach, Carol, that works for you?
Yes, as long as we get to vote, some suggestions that have been made we may not agree with. And we're not voting on
Right.
it, things. Wording and what group should be in and what group should be out, and all these suggestions that have been made.
Yeah, I would recommend that we wait to decide on that, Carol, until we get the public input next week. And then I think we'll have an idea of what the scope of this is, and then decide whether we need more meetings, how much of this we need to vote on, whether we kind of put it together and it's all up or all down, something like that. I think we need a little bit of time to see what the magnitude of the changes are. Some people are going to submit their written changes in the next couple of days, hopefully, to Renata and Eli, and they can incorporate it then.
Okay, thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, I kind of think ideally we try to stay out of the weeds on this. When we did the housing element, we went parcel by parcel, and we could easily do the same thing here. I kind of think, though, that it's like we want to try to hang on to the big picture if we can. I mean, I, for myself, will go through this, and I want to make sure I digest the logic because it's a framework that Placeworks used here, where they have a matrix. And I think if you think that the matrix is right, then the scoring is probably right. If you think that there's maybe you have a question about the elements of the matrix, then the scoring will change. I think that's probably the approach we should take, as opposed to me thinking, well, instead of a V3, it should be a V4 here, just because I think it should be. I think we need to think of what's the logic underneath this. And maybe for staff, if you get different perspectives on certain things, maybe just highlight those elements. And if we're just dealing with, like, I don't know, 5 items out of the 300 here, that's helpful, that we could focus on those. But I kind of think if we focus on like the approach, the methodology, the logic, then hopefully the other part should follow. And I think we ought to be providing the feedback to Renata here, so she can go through this and not do it right now. I mean, I know I need more time to digest this.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. Chris.
I was just going to second Matt and Jim on the approach here, because I really think it's a matter of an overall review of the structure of the vulnerability assessment. And then that's going to, because I haven't finished looking at it, because it's very dense. But if once we all understand the structure, then we can make any like information changes that might be needed, or suggestions. So I second both of you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Susie.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, that the structure is what's very important. And I think we also have to look at outcomes. Will it matter if a group is included or excluded? Is that going to affect the outcome of how we're going to deal with this? Because there's always going to be somebody who doesn't feel that they were represented or question why another group was. So I think we have to look at the overall picture. Have we been as comprehensive as possible without really going to extremes that will not affect the outcome other than us just being overwhelmed by the information? So I think that we should keep that in mind as we're reading through it and just kind of look at it, because our perspectives are all going to be different from where we live and who we are. So we have to take that into account a little bit, I think.
Okay, thank you, Susie. I'm just seeing other hands up. So I guess the final piece of feedback I'd like to give Eli and Renata is I would like to see in there a table that does kind of quantify as much as possible the different populations. I think from a policy making standpoint down the road, it's always an issue of limited resources, and you want to put your resources where it's going to make the biggest effect on the biggest population. And that's for policymakers to decide. And so I think if they have that information, Eli, I think it's helpful. You get bonus points if you apply that against the rankings. If you want to figure that one out, there's different ways to do it, but I'll let you figure whether you want to go for extra credit or not. But I think at least a table in there that shows the size of those populations, I think would be very helpful for policymakers down the road. Okay, with that, I think staff and Eli got a lot of work to do. And what we want to do now is to move on to committee member activity reports.
Chair, can we
has there been any
for the evening?
Oh,
I'm sorry?
Could we release Eli for the evening and thank him for his time tonight?
Eli will let you out of jail. Good night and thank you.
Thank you all very much.
good
Have a
night.
good
Thank you.
Eli. Activity reports. Does anybody have any activity reports? See no hands. So with that, we're going to move to housekeeping. Renata, do you want to talk a little bit about the upcoming January 24th safety element workshop roles and responsibilities?
Sure, yeah. So we are having a workshop for the public on Tuesday evening to discuss the initial findings of the vulnerability assessment. Thank you everyone who's signed up and is planning to attend that session. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. We'll be having a training on Monday afternoon for facilitators. You all should have gotten an email with your assignments for the time slots to go over the roles and responsibilities. But effectively, we will be splitting up GPAC members and potentially planning staff as well into small groups with members of the public and a GPAC member or a planner. In each group, there will be a facilitator and a note taker because it's kind of hard to do both at the same time well. It's like we all fool ourselves that we can multitask when we really can't. So that it's just to prime you to expect that, we'll be assigning roles, but everyone will be kind of equipped with the same foundation of kind of facilitation best practices, and we'll go over the content of the workshop in a little greater detail on Monday.
Jim, you got a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Are we going at a higher level here at this discussion? We're not dropping this mega spreadsheet on everyone, are we? Or I want to get a sense of like what altitude are we flying at for this program coming up?
Great question. Yes. So I think mostly we'll be focusing on those key vulnerabilities that were highlighted in the presentation tonight, and likely just providing the summary matrix, which is showing the kind of intersection of that scoring. And, the full detail will be available for those who really want it. But yeah, we're only going to be we're gonna be trying to limit it to an hour and a half session. That's including, you know, kind of a primer presentation, small groups, and then kind of a report out. So yeah, we're keeping it very, very high level as far as initial impressions. But the detail is available for those who want it, and we can answer questions in real time then too.
Okay, thank you.
Carol, you have a question?
Yes, will it be, the workshop will be people at the tables with the facilitator? Is that how it's gonna be?
Yes, so it'll be on Zoom. So we'll put everybody into breakout rooms with a facilitator and a note taker, and we'll be all going through the same discussion questions about the vulnerability assessment.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, next item we had is, I guess we are being forced to go to in-person meetings in the future. I know that's a very exciting prospect for some of us. Renata, you want to walk us through that?
Yes, so more detail forthcoming still. Actually, I have started conversations with a great friend Kathy at the library about room reservations. So still trying to figure out the right sizing of the room. But it seems like they can accommodate our meeting dates. So you know, no schedule change as knock on wood, as far as I know now. But I did have some initial conversation with Matt about kind of what documentation would be available for those who can't attend. And so I need to follow up on kind of the recording availability, availability of like audio recording, depending on the space that we end up in. So I will be following up with Kathy.
So we should be thinking about the March 21st GPAC meeting would be the first one that we would do either in person and hybrid potentially.
Correct. I do not think we'll be doing hybrid for GPAC, unfortunately, just given the resources that requires. But we'll do our best to find another mechanism to make a follow along medium available.
Thank you. Jim, you had a question?
Yeah, my understanding is the state is operating under remote meeting rules to the end of the fiscal year. Governor Newsom is going to do something, I guess, by the end of the fiscal year with respect to next fiscal year. But does that mean Lafayette's up? We're going in person in the nearer future? Is that the rubric here? I see the mayor shaking his head.
Yeah, mayor shaking his head.
We're not going willingly. If there's any chance that we can stay virtual, we're going to take it. At least that's my sense of, certainly my sense. And I think the majority of the council wants to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen our greatest participation since going virtual. And so I know as staff, that's something that would be helpful as well.
Chris.
So does that mean that if somebody wants to participate, like a citizen wants to participate, they actually have to come to the meeting, to the GPAC meeting?
Yes,
They
just
can't
like
call in.
the old times.
Yeah. And that's the worry. It'll decrease our public participation, which is one of the big things that we do.
But yeah, that's like our reason for being. And you want to make it as easy as possible.
That. Greg.
Yeah, one of the things that from the planning commission that we've been seeing, and I know I'm not speaking for anybody else, is yes, it makes it more accessible, but at the same time, it somewhat disadvantages a lot of the elderly who don't feel as comfortable communicating in that manner. We've had a couple items where, you know, some of the elderly neighbors that would be affected just didn't weigh in, and one younger person was speaking for all of them. And I don't want to disproportionately disadvantage any one segment of the population, especially people who've lived here for a very long time.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, final two items. Carol, I'm going to turn to you. You had raised an issue on the timing of our meetings and the material that we produce and the timing of getting feedback from the commissions in particular. This is more of an awareness issue than necessarily a change that she's recommending. But Carol, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you, Matt. I'd be happy to. My commission maybe in particular is interested in seeing some of this material. So I took the calendar for the 5 commissions and committees on GPAC, and none of their agendas coincide with GPAC in the sense of getting the material before their meeting and giving feedback to the GPAC meeting. And some of this has to do with the 72-hour before the agendas have to be published 72 hours before the meeting. Now, for instance, Park and Rec met on January 11th. None of this material was available. So we will discuss it at our next commission meeting, which is February 8th, and provide feedback. Now, by that time, you will have the public feedback from the 24th, and hopefully you will take into account Park and Rec's feedback. Now, this goes on all year, and it goes through the chamber, through the foundation, through senior services. So I don't know what the answer is to this. Maybe some of the other commissions, their commissioners aren't interested. As I say, I don't really have an answer for this, but if I have picked up now, like that garden was the rain garden, and I've mentioned some other things in the past, but my commission is interested in seeing some of this, particularly as it affects Park and Rec open spaces. So this would be this for BTR. This is going to be the situation almost, well, all year. There was no match where we could provide feedback on the material that GPAC will, for the meeting where GPAC will be considering that material. And this is my example. We have our meeting on all of this on the 8th of February, and we'll provide our feedback. Now, there was one time in the housing element when the Park and Rec did write a letter that didn't get considered at all because it was quite late for this very reason. So I'm not sure how GPAC wants to handle this, or staff, I guess. But just speaking for Park and Rec, they would like to be sure, you know, they are heard. They want to say something as a commission. So I will.
Yeah, I would.
Yes.
I would ask. I'm sorry. What I would suggest for all of us is all of you are on this because you've got some expertise with the group that you represent, whether it's a neighborhood or a commission or the chamber in my case. And because you're experts, you can give us feedback right away. You know what some of the issues are with Park and Rec. I know what they are with the chamber. But if you think that there are some issues that we uncovered, for example, tonight, that you're not sure if your commission is going to have a lot of feedback, you need to let us know, and we'll adjust the schedule accordingly. If indeed there's something serious there, and due to all the rules that Carol laid out, you know, we'll make some adjustments to that. But I would kind of view those as they would be the exception, as opposed to everything always has to sync up, because in some cases you guys know what the issues are and you provide the feedback. So that's kind of how I think about it. Renata, is there anything else that you might add to that?
No, I mean, I think, you know, there's a large window of time for comment. Again, all of it is draft until it is adopted. And commission members also can participate as private citizens, as residents of Lafayette as well. There is also nothing stopping a staff liaison from circulating our staff reports to commissions, just to give advance time and notice. So whenever we publish, you know, you could ask Jonathan, would you mind circulating this so the commission can review and consider it? So, but I think Matt's point that, you know, representatives are representing their commissions and have an idea of what might be raise an eyebrow in anything that we're reviewing, and provide that comment directly.
Carol, anything else on this?
Yes, those were interesting comments, but I could not, none of this material for this was out Jonathan had to put out our agenda on January 6th.
Yes, and but he can send emails to the commission, BCC'd,
Yeah, but
outside
it
of your
wasn't out.
regular agenda publication, right?
Yeah, but none of it was out. He is going to change our agenda to put discussion, not just a report from me, but a discussion by the commission on all our agendas. So we are covered. The other thing, yes, all the commissioners can comment as citizens, of course, but we're a rather active commission, and a lot of them would like to discuss it at the commission, especially when you get into the park and rec element and the open space element. All right, if we had this where none of the information was available on January 6th, and it was the recreation element, we couldn't report until February 8th, the commission, I'm sure would not be very happy about that. So maybe when we get to those elements, we could make some adjustment. I don't know how the Transportation Commission or seniors, feel about this, but it is the same problem for all of them.
Yeah, we've all got this challenge to some degree. Stella?
Yeah, thank you. We do also have this challenge with Transcirc, and one of the things that I spoke about it yesterday because we happened to have our regular meeting, and I hope I didn't speak out of turn, but what I had described was that at the end of the process, before the end, when we're nearing a draft stage, that there would be a staff report about the draft with the draft provided by planning, and planning representative would be able to attend that Transcirc meeting, make the presentation, and then accept any commission feedback at that point. Does that seem like a reasonable approach?
Potentially. I hesitate just because I was given direction to try and be efficient with our staff resources at this time. We did try in the past to send a staff report without a staff member to a commission. I don't think it went super smoothly. One thing we could explore is providing a recorded staff report, and then have the commission rep kind of bring the feedback back to staff. But I think there's some ways that we can accommodate that. That might be a little more effective.
And this would just be for that one meeting
final,
the end. Yeah. Yeah. And so for my meeting yesterday, I just gave a report on what was the agenda for this meeting, encouraged anyone to attend if they were interested. And that I would report back to them at our next meeting, which probably won't be for another month. But for our commission, it seemed like that was agreeable.
See, I didn't have an agenda to report on.
Yeah, I know. I told them that the timing just happened this way because we have the special meeting on Thursday, transcript's always on Wednesday. So it stars aligned for us this week, but it's not always the case.
Greg?
Yeah, thank you. What might help is, since we all represent different groups, is as this evolves, we just staff keeps a narrative of changes and, you know, who present them. Like, for example, I represent Planning Commission. If something comes up that that affects Parks and Rec, I'll just naturally defer to Carol's expertise. I know for planning with that downtown housing element, you know, we spent, city council changed our recommendations, and then we got back to us with, you know, not much notice about the why. And after about an hour's worth of discussion, you know, we realized, okay, this is why you pulled the BART block off. This is why you did this. This is why you did that. And I think that would help make these meetings go a little bit more smoothly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, final item is I had asked Mayor Anderi to kind of address the team as the year starts with his tenure as mayor, kind of his perspective on the value of GPAC to not just him as the mayor, but probably more importantly, the city council as a whole. So Carl, I'll give you the floor at this point.
Yeah, Chair Pease, thank you very much for the opportunity. On behalf of Vice Mayor Dawson and all our council members, and indeed on all the residents of Lafayette, I want to thank you for all the contributions that you've made to date and will be making to the development of our updated general plan. You know, it's interesting to think that this is only the third time that the general plan has been addressed in the history of Lafayette. So it really is, you know, a major undertaking and one that's going to have future significance. As you well know, some of you have been on this for almost 3 years. You've still got a long way to go. Maybe this isn't the kind of pep talk I should be giving, but there are many more elements that to be considered. The one you're working on now, though, I think is particularly interesting because 20 years ago, the state law that surrounded the safety element was completely different. You know, you're really getting into new areas that weren't even considered by the last general plan update committee. So it's going to be interesting to see where this leads. And I just want to say I appreciate, and certainly all fellow council members appreciate as well, your work, because you're looking at this far more closely than anybody else is looking at it, and certainly far more closely than the city council is going to be able to do it. So just sitting in on the meeting last year, sitting on today's meeting, it really brings home how much you get into the details. And I know there's an issue as to whether you should be looking at a higher policy level or looking at the details. But I have to say, I do appreciate your looking at the details and each and every one of the questions and comments that was made tonight, because that means somebody could be turning over something that's going to be very important for us in the future that we might not have thought of. I can guarantee that if you don't think about it during these detailed meetings, the council is not going to think about it. So the work is just very, very important. And what you're doing is going to be important to land planning and other decisions as we go forward. And just as an example, I thought of this example before the meeting, and then your discussion just showed how there's more to think about here. But if climate change increases the likelihood that our creeks are going to overflow and increases the magnitude of that overflow, what does that mean then for decisions we make about things like creek setbacks and how far they should be and how we enforce them? There's just a lot of things that if you think about them, bring them up, it's going to be important for how we make decisions over the next 20 years. So I want to thank you for taking the time to look at all the facets of these elements and making sure that we aren't missing something important for our future. So thank you very much.
Thank
Great.
you.
Carl, thank you very much. Appreciate the words. So with that, I am going to bring this to a close. I'm sure Mr. Cervantes will text me later that I went 15 minutes over.
Right.
And he will tell me that he always ran on time when he wasn't the chairman. So I'm sure I'm going to hear about this. But anyway, I appreciate everybody's time today, your thought. I want to welcome our new members, Mr. Mason and Mr. Brees. Thank you for joining us. And we will see everybody next week. So thank you very much. Good night.
You.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Well,